Thank you for that kind welcome. Good morning, everybody. Yes, I'm Sue Swaffield, and it's delightful to be here with you. It's wonderful to be actually in Homerton, which is where I came as a student many years ago when I first trained to be a teacher. Every summer, when I used to have a 6-week summer holiday, I would spend 4 of those weeks teaching on English courses for young people through the Bell Foundation, the Bell School. I then moved to local authority work, district work, and then in 2000 I came to the University of Cambridge back as a lecturer, and the Faculty of Education is that wooden and glass new building just across there. And there I've been ever since. As Rupert said, Cambridge is wonderful. I haven't managed to leave ever since I came as a student. And I teach and research in the broad areas of leadership, learning, assessment. I also am a syndic for Cambridge University Press. That means I'm one of the senior members of the university who's on a governing body for the press. So I have, again, the privilege of sort of getting to know the work quite well and hoping to help in terms of quality assurance and development, particularly in terms of pedagogy and so on. And I'm very much about linkages and making connections among people, but also between ideas. And the particular ideas that I'm asked to talk to you about this morning are leadership and learning. And we here at the faculty have something called leadership for learning. Now that's a pretty common phrase now. When I was appointed to the university as a lecturer in 2000, I joined an established team, and there was also another appointment to a new chair in leadership, Professor John Macbeth. Particularly John Macbeth, another colleague David Frost, myself. We kind of scratched our heads and thought, well, John and I have been appointed supposedly for a centre about leadership and learning, but we thought we were a bit uncomfortable with that. And we talked with lots of people in the local authorities, in other folk from all around the country and the world, and decided actually what we wanted was a network, not a centre. Centre makes it seem as though we knew everything. We wanted to kind of make connections. So we developed this idea of a leadership for learning network. And that, don't get distracted by it, but for later, that's where it is. Out of that, we thought, okay, we know we're interested in leadership for learning, leadership and learning. What do we actually mean by that? If you push us, what do we really mean by that? We knew we had various values, so we set out to have a research project, because at the University of Cambridge, of which the press is a part, research is absolutely integral to all we do, as you've just heard in the video. So there was a research project to see what people understand around the world by leadership, learning, and how they're connected. And that came to a framework of ideas, and that's the first part of what I'm going to talk to you and share with you about this morning. So I'll share that framework. I'll also tell you a little bit more about a particular project which is going on now, in conjunction actually with another part of the university, which again is closely connected with all of us, Cambridge Assessment, and a part of Cambridge Assessment is Cambridge International Exams. And this is a project that the faculty and Cambridge International Exams are working on together. So again, there are all the links and connections through. So this is a bit different from most of your sessions here because it's not specifically about language and language learning and teaching. I'm a teacher. When I asked, who are you? I would have put my hand up there. I'm a teacher. And I know the first thing about teaching is to find out where your learners are and teach accordingly. The American psychologist Bell made that clear for us. That's really hard in a situation like this. I know a tiny little bit about you, but I also know that learning is what goes on in your head. And whoever you are, whatever concerns you've brought this morning, what you take away from here will mostly depend on what you do in your head while I'm talking and sharing some slides with you. So I'm going to suggest a little routine which you can kind of run in your head while I'm talking and while you're listening. So the first thing is to connect. Anything you're hearing or seeing, think in your head, how does this connect with what you already know, with what you understand, with what your issues are, with what you're hoping to achieve? How does it extend those ideas? How does it extend your thinking? It may extend your thinking and knowledge and understanding in a very clear, straight, linear line. It may take you off at an angle. You may start thinking, oh yes, and then it veers off. Quite often, when we're learning, we find we actually end up going backwards before we start moving forwards again. So in extension, be aware of, it may go off in all sorts of different directions. And finally, challenge. How does what you're seeing, hearing, listening to, thinking, challenge your present understanding, your present knowledge, your ideas? It may be also that you want to challenge some of the things that you're hearing, and some of the things I'm saying and sharing with you. But that routine, connect, extend, challenge, it's actually one of a set of routines from David Perkins in Harvard and his team there that we use an awful lot. So it's just a thinking routine that I suggest you may find useful as I'm sharing things with you this morning. First section then, this Leadership for Learning set of ideas. Yeah? Essentially, it looks at those two ideas, leadership, learning, and thinks about how they're connected. And so let's look a little bit further at this framework that, as I said, was developed through a project. It was an international research project. After 3 years working together, we thought, okay, what have we learned? And I'll take you through some of it. In terms of what we understand by leadership and by learning, the key word here is both as activity. Yeah? These are already ideas that are making connections and resonating with things you've thought. So very specifically, we don't see leadership as a position, as a role, okay? It's something we can all do. That very first word in the list, I won't go through them all, but the influencing others, yeah? It's not role-bound at all. And learning also as activity. I've talked about the activity that's sort of going on in your head, if you like, today. But learning as a process is such a different concept from the idea of learning as a commodity, something that can be put into your heads. I can't do that. I actually really cringe and jump up and down and get cross with the word delivery in terms of learning. We can deliver resources to help learning. We cannot deliver learning, I believe. So learning is an activity. And so some of the things that you were saying about conditions and so on, making the environment for learning, you know, that's all linking in with this conceptualization of leadership and learning. The two are connected in lots of different ways, but maybe one of the ways is that we learn to lead through learning. If we've got a powerful learning experience, we might be able to learn to lead. We develop our capacity for leadership. Similarly, opportunities to exercise leadership actually enhance our learning. That's one way in which leadership and learning are connected. So what have we got so far? We've got big ideas. We've got ideas of leadership, learning, activity. There's a fourth big idea which creates, if you like, the framework or the base of a model, and it's a sort of a pictorial model that I'm building up to. And the other word there is agency. That's a word that came through and we used in the project and continue to use, but actually it's a word that lots of people find a bit uncomfortable. I did. It took me ages to get my head around it, really, and to put it into my everyday conversation and feel. But really it's about, as David Frost, my colleague, says, it's about having, or it involves having a sense of values and a kind of a personal identity, which is always contextually bound, and being able to pursue ideas and goals that you've had some say in determining. Not ones given to you, but you've been able to determine them in some ways or shape them. and to pursue those goals and aims by thinking self-consciously about some strategic action that is going to lead to those. It's not just, oh, well, I kind of like to, and I'll see what happens. It's actually kind of thinking it through. So that notion of agency, a sense of self, a sense of values, a sense of pursuing something that really matters, that I've been able to help shape, and thinking quite strategically about how to pursue those goals and then making it happen. So that's the notion of this idea of agency. And we seem to think that agency actually makes a link between that leadership and learning. So those notions of leadership as activity, learning as activity, it is about making the links. The moral purpose, which is coming through, and so often it is about spotting that moment, the moment that learners or ourselves are just about to make a big learning step, or even a small but really significant learning step. The leadership moment. How often have you, like me, thought afterwards, oh, I really should have said, done, whatever at the time? And sometimes it goes, doesn't it? And it's spotting that moment and thinking, yes, I know I can make a difference here. Now is the moment. So this idea of agency is really what we see as how key to how those two ideas of leadership as activity and learning as activity are connected. But really importantly for us in education is that these are all bounded by what we term moral purpose. We all know that leadership is not necessarily good. Bad things happen from leadership. Not all learning is necessarily good. So the whole idea of what, everything we're thinking about being bounded by a moral purpose is really important. I'm obviously skating over all these ideas to give you the framework, and each of these we could spend a whole day on, but let's press on so you get the big picture. To return now to think about learning, I've just been talking about learning generally, but actually there are different people involved in learning, what we've come to term different levels of learning. The most important, of course, are the students. Our learners, the learners that we're responsible for. But there's also ourselves and our colleagues, the professional learning. And a third layer would be what we term organisational learning. Perhaps you can think about your own organisations, whether it be schools, departments, universities, companies, whatever. To what extent do they have a sense of actually learning, and that the learning is bigger and stronger than the individuals that make it up? To what extent is there some organisational memory? To what extent does the organisation reflect on itself, do some self-evaluation, take note of it, think about it, move forward? This sort of personification of an organisation in that respect may be a little bit troublesome and maybe something some of you want to challenge, but I think that notion of a collective sense of learning as opposed to the individual sense of learning. Okay, they're ideas that we played together and worked together and emerged partly from this project. And we ended up with a whole list of about 30 really important statements we thought about the connection between leadership and learning. And I remember so clearly the times we were scratching our heads. When I say we, it was the Cambridge team, but there were university teams in each of the other sites and countries we were talking about. And sometimes we'd meet together in person, but mostly it was sort of calls and over the emails and electronic motions. What are we going to do? We can't possibly come out of this project with 30 statements, because I knew I would never remember them and nobody else will. So we looked at them and grouped them together. They fell into different groups. And we came to call these statements, or these groups, by 5 different headlines. And these 5 principles for practice really sum up the leadership for learning as we came to understand it from the project. Now, goodness me, don't they already link with some of those things that you were saying about a focus on learning? And of course, from there, you then think, well, who's learning? What kind of learning? Etc., etc. conditions for learning. Conditions for learning, not just physical conditions, resource conditions. I do a lot of work in Ghana, and my goodness, the conditions for learning in many schools there are very different from the kind of resources and conditions that I'm sure some of you are fortunate enough to work in. But it is, and physical conditions are important, but it's not only physical conditions. It's very much and very importantly emotional, social conditions. You know, are kids scared stiff? Are they worried, in some cases, about actually physical punishment? Are they worried about letting themselves down, their parents down? Are they worried about the future? If you're too worried, you can't learn. So when we're talking about conditions for learning, we're thinking about it in all sorts of ways. Dialogue comes from the Greek. I don't need to tell you this, do I? Goodness me. You're the language people, but meaning flowing through. Yeah? So it's creating the meaning. And dialogue is, in its form, different from discussion when you're kind of discursive and I want to get my, or debate. Dialogue is actually a genuine way of trying to think, how can we develop our understanding together? We actually have at the faculty a whole centre on dialogue now, a network sort of set up there. Shared leadership, anybody and everybody can do it. And when I say everybody, I mean the students as well. We have so much to learn from our students. We just need to create the conditions in order to do that. The final principle we have here is a shared sense of accountability. We ummed and ahed about this one for ages, and accountability and responsibility and so on. But it's the world we live in, and also it is part of our moral purpose. We are responsible, we are accountable, we should be accountable to others for what we are doing in order to help most of us young people learn. But whatever our role is. So that shared sense of accountability. And again, it's sort of within that moral framework. So we put together all the pieces of a framework. And then we said, okay, we've got 5 principles, and I actually can remember those, which is jolly useful. So I can, talk about this all the time. But maybe a visual might help as well. And it may work for you, it may not work for you. But can you see there the base of the ideas, leadership, learning, activity and agency. 3 layers of learning, student learning, the biggest one, professional learning, organisational learning, leadership, which is influence, remembering, flowing through among them. Looks a bit like a wedding cake, doesn't it? But it's a wedding cake, I guess, unlike anything you've seen before, because it's a pentagonal wedding cake. The pentagon to represent those 5 principles. But very importantly, framed by moral purpose. Okay? So that's a representation of it. We've got the whole book, which explains things more. We're actually in the middle of writing another book now because several years on, things have developed and we're able to expand. We always thought this would change, actually, and the principles would change. We're not going to change those. We've found they've stood the test of time. Interestingly, also, I mentioned the work in Ghana. How do we do that? Well, they haven't got websites. There's no good me saying go to the website. So we came up with this idea, which is a representation of that network in a different way. And essentially what it does is just take those different aspects. It's an aide-memoire for it. We've got the framework itself, and then we've got a section on the foundational ideas about leadership, learning, agency, moral purpose. Then we have a section with each of the different principles elaborated. So those little words there are the elaborations of the principle underneath. The different levels of learning in the green at the bottom there. And then around the blue, some prompts, some of the thinking prompts that we've been using. So that's the framework in essence. Well, a framework ain't much use unless it's used. And it has been used in lots of different contexts, including this international project I was telling you about, which we're currently in the middle of a 2-year project with Cambridge schools. And these schools were invited to apply to join the project, but these schools said that, yeah, they're willing to, they wanted to explore this, they wanted to think about their professional practice, especially in relation to leadership and learning. They were up for using research and for contributing to research. We are the University of Cambridge. Research runs through everything we do. And they were interested in networking with each other or with other people around the world. And so we've set up this project which has at its centre a development project. Each school has identified a particular project that they want to work on, a particular focus for their project in their school, which is relevant to their school. And how they got there was through a couple of things, particularly over here, this notion of portraiture. It was an idea of saying, okay, think about your school and sort of create a portrait of it. Not a marketing thing that you do on your website, you know, which has a particular purpose, but actually an honest look at your school, all the great things and some of the warts and the challenges as well. And so we supported schools in that process. Also, a self-evaluation questionnaire. This is a questionnaire that we've used over many years, developed over many years. Those two things particularly led into the development and the identification of a particular project. Something that's important to them, so schools identifying their own goal, relates to their current school improvement plans and so on. They did that through the help with critical friendship. So we have 2 critical friends who are linked with the schools, and also the schools are able to work with each other through the community platform. And in fact, last September, they came to a conference that we held here, again in Homerton, and were able to meet each other, just as you're doing, and launch this project. And we support them with webinars and so on. So they're the elements of the project. And its purposes were very much about to help the schools to reflect and self-evaluate and to identify their focus, but also to share information with the other schools in the project. I say we do it on the platform, but it's a closed platform. So it's only open to the schools and those of us in the project. So people can be open within it and, you know, being able to say, this is what I'm really struggling with. You know, the stuff you don't put on the public website. But somebody else can say, yeah, do you know, we struggled with that a few years ago and we tried this. It may not work for you in your context, but there may be some ideas within that to develop. So that's the sort of the idea of the portraiture. And in fact, the portrait is not a static portrait, it's more of a moving image. Because as people are developing their projects and seeing how they're going about it and how they're developing it, they're adding that to the portrait too. The questionnaire I told you a little bit about, based on 30 items, all related different ways to leadership and learning. And the particular features are that there are 2 scales on it. So for any statement, this one says that school staff show they are able to learn from their students. Okay, so that's a statement. And then people are asked to say, to what extent does this reflect practice in your school? From disagree to agree. And then another scale which says about importance. How do you rate the importance of the statement? So for each of 30 statements, people are asked to say, is this happening? Is it important? And then, of course, we can look at the gaps. If something's really important but it's not happening, that might well be a very important, sensible place to start thinking about some action. We also do this with versions for staff and for students. So again, you can then compare with, you know, the students think this is incredibly important, but the staff don't. So what does that say? The questionnaire raises questions. It's designed to provoke thinking. It's not a rating, it's not a measuring, right? It's to raise questions. These aren't, you know, you scored 4. Oh, well done, you know, or you scored only 2. No, it's not that at all. It's the raising the questions. And so, for example, from one of the schools, the feedback we gave, these were big headlines that came out of a questionnaire. Staff and students agree and value that teachers ask questions in lessons. Both staff and students also believe it's important that teachers modify their practice in the light of what their students' work shows or what the students tell them. There does appear scope, however, to enhance opportunities for staff and student participation in decision making. Staff and students also both consider a number of items to be of low importance. For example, staff showing they're able to learn from students. Neither of them thought that was important at all. And then thinking about the Leadership for Learning principles, because each of those statements are rated to principles, so we can look at them in groups. And at the principle level, conditions for learning are highly valued by students and staff. So that's an example of the kind of headline feedback, obviously with much more unpacked underneath. I told you we do webinars, so just a slideshow of doing that. I told you we have schools identifying their own development areas. A couple of examples here. One of them is developing a teachers' community which is very much focused on student learning. They decided that they really needed to develop and implement more student-centred pedagogies in their school, and that the way to do that was through a teacher community. And that's what they're working on. It links, to, as you can see, to certain Leadership for Learning principles, a focus of learning, both teachers and students in this case. Dialogue, particularly among the teachers, because this was a school where they perhaps were a bit in silos in their departments and not spreading the ideas across very much. And shared leadership, that actually some of the newer, younger teachers who haven't necessarily got a role have got some great ideas to share as well, and the community is enabling them to do that. Another school, as a result of their portraiture, their questionnaire, and thinking about their general school improvement plans anyway, thought that they really needed to help the students identify their career aspirations and interests rather earlier. By doing that, they thought they would get the students much more engaged, if they've really got the students who've got something to aim for. And for the teachers and the school to be providing a variety of learning opportunities for the students. So, that's the project. These are the areas around the world where the schools come from that are actually involved in this. But that's just one of a whole variety of projects and so on that we've worked with, and that Leadership for Learning, the framework, is central to. You've seen how the framework is sort of part of the language used in that project. It gives a common language for speaking about. It gives a framework for thinking. And we've done lots of other projects like that or similar, and lots of other people have picked up the framework and used it in different ways. I would say that we do engage in the real world in lots of different places. One of them, for example, I mentioned, I've been working in Ghana for the last 8 years. We were invited to go there. The notions of and the understanding about learning there in many schools is very different. Teacher talks, pupils listen, they get beaten if they don't listen, don't do it, some of them. It's a real challenge, and I do not underestimate the extent of the challenge. But I think that signs of hope are that if we think about leadership being in everybody's hands and the notion of moral purpose, it is something that we can only keep trying at. We can make a difference every day in the classrooms with the students and the people that we work with. And on a political level, the dialogue, I believe, is the only way we can do it. Now, that is not a panacea, and in terms of the research, our research always depends on having funding and being able to frame it in a way that satisfies all the different people to whom we are accountable and responsible. I don't want you to think that the network is the be-all and end-all and everything. The network is a communication thing that enables us to tell people about Leadership for Learning work and for them to contribute to it. It isn't working, unfortunately, the whole network, as a communication among people. It's run by a part-time administrator, a part-time coordinator, both of whom have to be funded totally by work outside our mainstream work earned by me and one other. All right, so it's pretty titchy in that way. In terms of the project, though, when we are funded for a project, we can support much more strongly and fully, and main ways of supporting this are through the critical friends who are online and working with these people, and through the webinars when we meet together, and through the online chat and sort of discussions that the people in the project do. Projects, of course, have to have a life, although interestingly we call the Ghana programme a programme because it's been taken over and was always set up to be in collaboration with the Ghana Education Service. Obviously, we're hoping that everybody will be a learner and that people continue to support each other, but autonomous learning doesn't mean you do it on your own. It means you know when you want and need other people's help, and so you go and look for that. Okay. Thank you very much indeed for your attention this morning. I hope that some of the ideas I've shared with you make some resonances and some connections. Thanks very much indeed.